If you were to squeeze the entire history of life down into a single 24-hour day, then modern humans, also known as Homo sapiens, would show up less than 8 seconds before midnight. In other words, we ain't that old. And yet, in those few seconds, which is about our 350,000 years of existence, the Earth has changed. In some ways, not a whole lot, but in other ways, an incredible amount. And if you were somehow zapped back to when humans first showed up, you'd see a lot of strange stuff. But what exactly would times you see? At the time, Homo sapiens were pretty much chilling in continental Africa and stayed there for a good long while, not really moving around all that much until anatomically modern people finally spread out about 70,000 or so years ago. Or at least, that's the big move, whose descendants managed to survive and populate the rest of the world. During this long period of just hanging out in Africa, our ancestors would have run into all kinds of different landscapes, and, more importantly, animals that sadly, or maybe gladly, depending on how you look at it, no longer walk the face of the earth. Off the top of your head, you might be picturing things like saber-toothed tigers, crazy-looking stegodons, and other bizarre Pleistocene, or Ice Age, animals. And while creatures like that were definitely roaming the rest of the world, they weren't what the first modern people saw. In fact, a lot of the iconic animals we link with recent prehistory either never even set foot in Africa, or were long gone from the continent by the time we evolved. Instead, Africa was on a totally different evolutionary path compared to other places. The extinct animals there followed a weird trend of looking a lot like the ones we still have today, but just being slightly off. A perfect example of this is the Palaeoloxodon. Besides their really obvious bone growths on top of their skulls, this extinct elephant looked a lot like the ones alive today, especially if you saw one from far away. But if you did happen to get up close, you'd notice its proportions were all wrong, because this mammal was an absolute giant. It's currently considered the largest mammal to have ever walked the earth, but at the same time, it's also the smallest elephant to have ever lived. How is that possible, you ask? Well, there were a bunch of different species in this genus that varied wildly in size, to say the least. Most of them were extinct by the late Pleistocene, and the majority of the ones left were outside of Africa, leaving only one species that early modern humans ever saw, the Palaeoloxodon jalensis. This 13,000-year-old species wasn't the biggest Palaeoloxodon, but it was definitely up there. It was likely a direct descendant of the second largest member, the Reki, and from what few remains we have, it looks like jalensis was pretty much identical in size to its ancestor, which is insane, considering that the Reki was recently estimated to have stood at 4.2 meters, or 13.9 feet, at the shoulders, while weighing 15.3 tons, making it not only heavier than any theropod dinosaur ever, but also 50% bigger than the heaviest African bush elephant on record. So, with that in mind, you probably won't be surprised to hear that this size carried over to its tusks as well. But even for a 15-ton elephant, their tusks were abnormally massive. Palaeoloxodon in general had the longest tusk-to-body ratio of any known elephant, resulting in tusks as long as the entire bodies of some other elephant species. These tusks were also straighter than usual and closer to the ground, which would have let the jalensis easily strike smaller targets and mess with the ground, maybe even using its tusks like a shovel in some situations. And to make this mammal just a little bit more terrifying, those bony bumps on its skull that I mentioned are thought to have served the purpose of making its tusks even deadlier. They were anchor points for a bunch of huge muscles that supported their heads, letting them swing those weapons around with even more force and speed. So by now, you'd think that any sensible creature would have figured out that you do not want to mess with a supercharged giant elephant. And yet, researchers believe that modern humans might have actually hunted these absolute units. While no concrete proof exists, we do know that other Homo species in Eurasia were able to regularly hunt and butcher Palaeoloxodons of a similar size using weapons like spears. And not to mention, we also had javelins at this point too. Now, that being said, if hunting did happen, it was probably not an everyday thing, considering Palaeoloxodon was the largest animal on the entire continent. Any attempt would have come with a ton of risks, And besides, there were plenty of other megafauna to choose from that were both smaller and less equipped. And while this often made for easier hunting, smaller doesn't always mean easy. A perfect example of that is Cincerus antiquus, known more casually as the giant buffalo. Despite being way smaller than Palaeoloxodon, this extinct bovid was still an absolute menace to society, and is actually the largest bovid to have ever lived in Africa, with adults measuring about 3 meters or 10 feet long, and standing 6.1 feet or 1.85 meters tall at the withers. So, in other words, taller than most moose. They were absolutely packed with dense muscle and had incredibly thick bones, which meant the bigger males could easily top 2.2 tons. To put that in perspective, that's about the weight of a modern white rhino, the biggest rhino on Earth. And when you think about that comparison, remember that a rhino's weight is bulked up by its skin, which is basically a suit of armor. But this ancient beast, its weight was pure muscle, bone, and a bit of keratin, because these things had horns that would have made a rhino jealous. They jutted out to the sides with a slight curve, and they were seriously long, possibly stretching over 1 meter or 3 feet each. They looked a lot like the horns on a water buffalo, which makes sense since they're a close relative. And on the really huge individuals, it's believed these horns could have spanned 3 meters or 10 feet from tip to tip. That's as wide as a basketball hoop is tall, and longer than the horns of most horned dinosaurs, even some that were 3 times its size. So, to fuel that massive body and those incredible horns, this giant bovid probably had to graze on enormous amounts of plants. That, combined with the fact that they likely moved in huge herds, meant they had a massive impact on the massive environment they lived in. Their movements would have carved huge paths through the landscape, which, funnily enough, would have made them pretty easy to track. This might have tempted some of the braver predators, like, say, early humans, to try their luck. But finding one was a whole lot easier than actually taking one down, because these animals were not afraid to use their horns. Not even a little. And how do we know this? We've basically got eyewitness accounts, left by our own ancestors. You see, these giant bulls show up all the time in cave art across Africa, and they're usually drawn right in the middle of a fight, typically with other bulls. Most of them are in a face-down stance, getting ready to ram their horns into their opponents. In fact, these brawls were so common that this animal holds the record for the most depictions of violence in cave art, which heavily suggests it had a pretty short fuse. It also probably helped that it could likely charge at top speeds of 35 miles or 56 kilometers per hour. Basically, anything it hit, short of maybe a straight-tusked elephant, was getting completely wrecked. Of course, even with those huge horns, their size and their sheer ferocity, that didn't stop us from hunting them. And it didn't stop other times, us, either. And by that, I'm talking about other human species. As you probably know, multiple types of humans have walked the earth, but people often forget it wasn't a simple ladder leading straight to us, with one species neatly replacing the next. Instead, there was a surprising amount of overlap, which hit its peak right around the time the first modern humans showed up. About 300,000 years ago, there were 4 distinct Homo species, all living in Africa at the same time. Now, not necessarily in the same neighborhood, but close enough that they could have run into each other. Alongside our species, asterisk, Homo sapiens asterisk, you had times Homo naledi asterisk, asterisk Homo rhodesiensis asterisk, and times Homo heidelbergensis asterisk. So yeah, it was a crowded landscape. By this point, a couple of them had been around for hundreds of thousands of years, while we, on the other hand, were the new kids on the block. And even though they all had a lot of similarities to us, it's fair to assume that our ancestors saw some of these other humans as, well, not like us. Especially times Homo naledi, times the real oddball of the bunch. This archaic human was pretty primitive compared to the others, and was a lot more like times Australopithecus asterisk, an even earlier hominin that our own genus evolved from. Just like our distant ancestors, asterisk naledi times was really comfortable in the trees. Its body was built for a life of climbing, which meant it couldn't run very well on the ground. They were also really small compared to us. One of the smallest human species ever, actually. And they had small brains to match. So far, we haven't found any kind of complex tools associated with them, which might mean they had a much lower level of technology, making it hard for them to compete with us or the other, more advanced human species. On top of that, their diet wasn't great either. It seems they mostly ate gritty food they picked up off the ground, covered in dust and dirt. We know this because their teeth are almost always worn down. So, it would have been obvious to early modern humans that these guys were very different. But the line got a lot blurrier with the others, especially times Homo heidelbergensis asterisk. While times naledi times is only known from South Africa, asterisk heidelbergensis times fossils have been found in various African countries, and they eventually spread off the continent too. Overall, they were pretty similar to modern humans. They were about our height and had a similar brain size. The main difference was in their build. They were a bit more like Neanderthals, with wide chests and powerful frames that made them tougher and almost certainly stronger than we were. Let's just say, in a one-on-one fight, I know who my money would be on. They also had technology that was on par with ours. Their remains are often found with evidence of fire, primitive shelters, spears, hand, tools, and even art. And these skills ultimately allowed them to spread out and thrive across a huge area in Africa, where they mostly ate meat. They were expert hunters, specializing in taking down large animals. And this overlap, in both the territory they called home and the food they hunted, could have easily led to confrontations with times Homo sapiens asterisk. Now, you might think any showdown would have involved violence, but interestingly, there's a chance they might have just talked things out. Well, maybe not with words, but with symbols. Studies of their hyoid bone and middle ears show that, theoretically, they could have had speech similar to ours and possessed some kind of early language. That kind of communication would have been a game changer for teamwork. And sure enough, we've found sites that show some seriously advanced cooperation. One in Kenya, for example, had the remains of over 50 butchered giant baboons, proving that these early humans, the heidelbergensis, meant business. And that business likely put them in contact with the rhodesiensis, a slightly older type of Homo from Zambia, who was so similar to heidelbergensis that a lot of people think they're actually the same species, just with a different name. But whatever the case, it's clear these two were intelligent and a lot like us modern humans, making any contact between them and our own species a super interesting topic. For now, though, we don't have any direct proof of them interacting with us. But there is at least one study claiming we did interbreed with them to some degree, in sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, some researchers believe they might be our direct ancestors. I should mention, though, that this idea has gotten a lot of pushback recently, but it's technically still a possibility, just one that's shrouded in mystery. And speaking of cloudy interactions with our fellow Homo species, let's talk about the scariest baboon-like creature nature has ever cooked up, the Dinopithecus. Right now, it's a toss-up whether this primate ever even met Homo sapiens, since its fossil record is super limited. There's a real chance it went extinct before we even got there, but it was such a strange and terrifying animal that I just have to mention it. Its name literally means terrible ape, and Dinopithecus was a primate larger than an average man. Some of them hit 77 kilograms, or 170 pounds in weight, and came packed with some deceptively powerful muscles, and a giant skull that housed these menacing canine teeth, a full 20% bigger than what you see in the largest baboons today. So far, their fossil remains have only been found in South Africa and Ethiopia, where it's thought they lived a bit like modern baboons, sticking mostly to the ground and roaming the plains instead of swinging through trees. This makes a potential tap, run-in with our ancestors, all the more likely if their timelines did overlap. But unlike baboons, and different from most of its close relatives, the Dinopithecus rarely ate grass or other savanna foods. Instead, it was gorging itself on fruits and, perhaps, even the odd piece of meat here and there. Paleontologists think it was an opportunistic feeder, probably eating more flesh than the vast majority of primates up to that point. On top of that, thanks to its size and those wicked canines, some have speculated that earlier, smaller Homo species might have been an occasional snack. The only silver lining here is that, thanks to our size and technology, we were most likely in the clear. And, obviously, I Don't wish anything bad on our ancestors, but it would be pretty cool if they really did live alongside this essentially roided out baboon. Now, besides that guy, there was another animal that matched the Dinopithecus for sheer weirdness, even though it wasn't nearly as dangerous. And this one definitely did live among us, the Ruzinxerix, also known as the dinosaur wildebeest. And yes, it did look a little off compared to animals today, thanks to its long and thickened neck. But you wouldn't be able to tell just how bizarre it was by using your eyes. Instead, you would have had to use your ears, because while this animal didn't look like a dinosaur, it sure could have sounded like one specifically, a hadrosaur. When they were first discovered, paleontologists noticed that inside their skulls, Ruzinxerix had these large, trumpet-like nasal structures that were unlike anything seen in other mammals, yet were eerily similar to those found in hadrosaurs. In fact, its design is so unique that researchers don't know of any other animal, besides a certain family of duck-billed dinosaurs, with that kind of anatomy. The researchers who found this creature believe that it evolved this feature through convergent evolution, thanks to a shared lifestyle with hadrosaurs. Both lived in huge herds in fairly open areas, and for that, a unique way of communicating would have come in really handy. On top of that, both hadrosaurs and the Ruzinxerix had very specialized diets and teeth, which might have indirectly pushed them to develop these unique skull structures, resulting in their one-of-a-kind nasal passages. And in the case of the Ruzinxerix, it's thought that they were able to create sounds so much lower than their normal vocal ranges that they could actually achieve infrasound if they wanted, to a frequency that's way too low for humans to hear. In other words, they could literally be having a shouting match, and it would still be quiet enough for a library. Now, all this talk about silence might have made you hungry. And I say this because out of all the animals on this list so far, the Ruzinxerix is the only one where we have actual skeletal evidence confirming our ancestors hunted it, by sapiens, with evidence from a site in Kenya showing butcher marks right next to human tools. The way the group died strongly suggests that humans were likely hunting this massive, wildebeest-sized animal, with some folks even guessing that we are what ultimately drove them to extinction. Now, another animal that has since vanished is one that, at first glance, looks incredibly familiar. The Metrodiochoeris. This extinct pig could have easily taken Pumbaa's place in The Lion King, since it was pretty much a carbon copy of the warthogs we know and love today. And sure enough, it's thought to be their direct ancestor. But there was one big difference. This ancient warthog-like beast was an absolute chunkster. The average one was as big as the largest. Warthogs alive right now, measuring about 5 feet or 1.52 meters. And while that's impressive, things get really wild when you look at the weight. Because even though you can find modern warthogs that match its length, the Metrodiochoeris was unbelievably dense. So dense, in fact, that one of its species is literally named Compactus. These animals could weigh more than twice as much as a modern warthog of the same size, with some estimates even suggesting the bigger ones weighed over half a ton. So basically, you're looking at a horse, but shaped like a warthog. And as you know, warthogs can be pretty feisty and aggressive, a trait this ancient pig likely shared. That idea gets a lot scarier when you learn that Metrodiochoeris had 4 tusks that were proportionally longer, sharper, and straighter than the ones seen today, making its head look almost like the spiky tail of a stegosaurus. Just like its living relatives, the Metrodiochoeris probably used these tusks for all sorts of things, including fighting, so you definitely would have wanted to keep your distance from this guy. That would have been a little tough though, since they were found across a huge chunk of the continent and were typically out and about living a grazing lifestyle. But this animal, and the others we mentioned, weren't the only familiar faces around. Back then, you also had many more types of rhinos, zebras, and giraffes. But unlike the giant pig, they weren't necessarily monstrous in size compared to their modern relatives. Instead, they brought their own unique twists. For example, there was a species of zebra that lived in the Sahara, which is totally a zebra-free zone today. Then you had a giraffe that was slightly taller than modern ones, and it also liked to travel outside of Africa sometimes, with most of its fossils actually being found in Turkey. And then, perhaps most fascinating of all, you had a hairy rhinoceros, specifically the Stephanorhinus hemitochus, or the steppe rhino for short. Unlike today, this rhino could be found in northern Africa over 200,000 years ago. And compared to living rhinos, the steppe rhino preferred slightly colder habitats, which likely explains its sparse hairy coat that made it look a bit like a woolly rhino, just not quite as huge. It was more comparable to a modern white rhinoceros. And despite being called the steppe rhino, you could actually find this creature patrolling
This chart
and woodland areas
illustrates
where
the
we know it frequently
remarkable
crossed paths with people.
diversity among
And how do we know this,
early
you ask?
mammals.
Well, I'll let Nora to
Comparing the
explain.
ancestors
Hominins have been
of
hunting
the
giant animals for hundreds of
rhinoceros.
thousands of years, including the first modern humans. Multiple sites have shown us proof of people hunting and butchering this animal, including a set of stone tools in Jordan dating back around 250,000 years ago. It might sound far-fetched that ancient humans could have been able to take down such a massive animal with only simple tools, but through experimentation, I've found these weapons are capable of much more than you'd think. Simple wooden javelins can easily pierce an animal's vitals if they slip between the ribs, while stone points are even able to smash right through bone. By this time, humans had developed sophisticated stone tools which were attached to spears and presumably thrown. These people would have been able to take down any animal in their world with the right strategy. There is also evidence that we viewed this creature with high esteem and respect, at least if you consider our Neanderthal cousins, as the Steppe-rhino was one of the few animals that occasionally became trophies for Neanderthal hunters, who kept their skulls, probably as prizes. The funny thing is, while there's tons of evidence this animal was hunted, a study found there's little to support that its disappearance, some 35,000 years ago, was directly tied to human overhunting. But, as with many other Pleistocene extinctions, it is a matter of debate. After this video, come on over to my channel to learn about the fearsome animals the first Native Americans encountered, the evidence we have of their interactions, and the effectiveness of their stone tool technology. Back to Extinct Zoo. And this generally follows the trend, because while many animals did go extinct in Africa during the late Pleistocene, they seem to have been doomed, with or without us. Compared to the rest of the world, Africa managed to retain a remarkable amount of its megafauna, a prime reason why it's such an incredible place. You might picture our ancient relatives walking through a world filled with bizarre, alien-like beasts, but the reality is a bit different. The truth is, the most wonderfully weird creatures on Earth are the ones still roaming the planet today. And you know what? Let's do everything we can to keep them around. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time, right here on X Think Zoo.